All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to the very last or fifth video in our series of budgetary policy for Unit 4, Area Study 1, Aggregate Demand Side Policies for Unit 4, Economics. Today we're going to be talking about how the government finances a budget deficit, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of budgetary policy as an aggregate demand side measure. There's not a lot to it really, we'll just get straight into it. So, we are looking at this very last point mainly, so the strengths and weaknesses of budgetary policy to achieve government domestic macroeconomic goals and how those goals may affect living standards. So all of this stuff in the bottom area there. All right, cool. So let's keep rolling. So sometimes it comes up a little bit. It's important to look at the difference between an expansionary and contractionary budget. So any budget deficit, so a budget deficit of $10 billion is considered to be expansionary because the government is injecting $10 billion more than it is earning in revenue into the economy to expand economic activity. So any budget deficit is considered to be expansionary because they are increasing the amount of money being injected into the economy to increase economic activity. So that usually means we've got to borrow money from somewhere to finance that, but it is expansionary because it's trying to stimulate economic activity. Any surplus is considered contractionary, as the government is taking 10 billion, in this case 10 billion more than it's injecting, and in the shorter term should slow down economic activity. A balanced budget tends to be rare and is neither expansionary or contractionary. Some confusion over the last few years in the VCAR exam has been the government reducing the size of their deficit. And a lot of people used to get in trouble or lose marks because they'd say that a reduced deficit is contractionary. Well, if we are in deficit, it's always expansionary. So if we have a reduced deficit or we're moving towards surplus but don't quite hit it, if we have a deficit at the end of that budget outcome, it is expansionary, although it might be slightly less expansionary than previous budgets. So how does the government finance a deficit or invest a surplus? So to finance a deficit, the government can do it in a few different ways. They can sell bonds to the RBA, which removes money from the money supply and puts upward pressure on interest rates. There's a limited amount of money to borrow in Australia, so if the government does that by selling bonds to the RBA, it can reduce the amount of money available to borrow and put pressure on interest rates to increase, which isn't great when we want a low interest rate to stimulate spending as well. So that doesn't happen too often at the moment. Selling bonds to Australian investors, which increases demand in financial markets, putting upward pressure on interest rates as well and causing crowding out, which is one of the most common forms of budget financing. So this is what we're talking about in a previous video, where the government will sell bonds to private investors where they say, if you give us X amount of dollars, we will give you that and a little bit more in return after this amount of years. And so it's a good way, it's a safe investment for a lot of people, and that's why they do it. And then there is selling bonds to overseas investors, which capital inflow puts upward pressure on the Australian dollar, which has a negative impact on exports and aggregate demand. And this has become less common over time. So if we sell bonds to overseas investors, basically what's going to happen is that in the short term, it puts upward pressure on Australian dollars because those people use their currency to buy Australian dollars, taking them off the foreign exchange market, meaning there's less Australian dollars available, which means it's higher in value because it's more scarce. And if our dollar rises in value, it actually hurts exports and aggregate demand, which defeats the purpose. So we don't do that as much anymore. There's been a lot of talk over the last 10 to 15 years about what's called fiscal consolidation. We talked about it a little bit in a previous PowerPoint, but about why governments want to move towards surplus, like why they keep pushing for a surplus and keep trying to get a surplus. Why we wanted to have a $7.1 billion surplus this year, which we will not achieve. Some of the reasons for it is that it helps protect Australia's AAA credit rating. Basically, by having a AAA credit rating, it means when we borrow money from overseas, we don't get charged as much interest, which is obviously ideal. If that goes down, we're going to start having to pay higher rates of interest, which means that it will take us even longer to pay back our foreign debt of over $1 trillion, which is not a good thing. So we want to protect that AAA credit rating, which is potentially going to go down in the future, depending on how the world goes. It also will help give Australia a buffer against future economic decline. So if we get towards a budget surplus, it means we can put aside that money for a rainy day. Much like this pandemic, if we had money saved, it would be in less strife overall because we'd be better able to finance any reparations we need to make to keep the economy stimulated. It also allows monetary policy to better manage the economy with less fear of inflationary pressures. So if we're in a surplus and the government's not having to do as much to stimulate economic activity, monetary policy will be way more effective because people feel more confident, they'll be less worried about the future, and monetary policy will then actually be an effective tool at making people behave in different ways. So some strengths and weaknesses of budgetary policy. One strength is it can target particular sectors. Actually, before we go into these specifically, with strengths and weaknesses, like whenever there's any kind of strengths and weaknesses, you're guaranteed you're going to get an evaluate or a discuss type question. So you can almost guarantee that on your stack for budgetary policy, you'll be like, discuss the use of budgetary policy in achieving one of the government's domestic macroeconomic goals. And then you'll be like, one strength, blah, 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 blah. One weakness, blah, 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 blah. And so that's really important because we've got a giant list of strengths, a giant list of weaknesses, but realistically, you only need to be good at maybe 2 or 3 of each of them. If you just want to play the game and do really well on the VCAR exam, you don't need to know this list of 8 strengths because there's not going to be a question where it's like worth 14 marks and it's just like explain 7 strengths of budgetary policy. That's not going to happen. That's not good exam technique to know them all. So just remember the ones that you think will be most useful to you. So the first one can target particular sectors. Budgetary policy is great in that it can focus on specific areas that need stimulating in the economy. So most recently, you see the government putting in measures to not quite budgetary policy, more stimulus packages, but they can target the people who are losing their jobs, or they can target businesses who are going to lay people off so they definitely keep their jobs, and that's targeting particular sectors. It's able to target more goals than monetary policy. Because of that, it can focus on employment, strong and stable economic growth and inflation all separately by doing different things. The impact lag is shorter than monetary policy, so the impact lag means how long it takes to take effect. And so monetary policy, sometimes it can take up to 2 years to feel the full effects of an interest rate cut or a cash rate cut, whereas sometimes with budgetary policy, so if they decrease personal income tax rate, from the date that that happens, your next pay you have more money and you can spend that more money. So the impact is near instant. It's effective at stimulating aggregate demand. So I've had a lot of stimulus packages recently, but if you went back to when we had the stimulus package in the GFC, you'd see that it was really effective at stimulating aggregate demand because people suddenly had more money. And if you are given money that you didn't have to earn, you tend to spend it kind of recklessly for the most part. Like some smart people save it even though you're not meant to. But I always kind of compare it to when you get birthday money. And when you get birthday money, you just go out and buy whatever you want because you're just like, sweet, I didn't have to work for this money. I can get something that I want. I can treat myself. And it kind of works in a similar way. Automatic stabilizers help cushion us in an economic downturn. So when we start going into a contraction down towards a trough, it automatically starts paying more welfare and taking less tax from people to try and soften that blow of a downturn. It includes many checks and balances through Parliament, so they have to vote to pass any of these changes to prevent any ill-designed policies from passing. So it means that the government has to pass things that are going to be beneficial. It's open to public scrutiny. If the government announces a budget and people hate it, the government will probably change it because people will not agree with that and people will not vote for a government that are doing things they do not like. And it can be very responsive to the needs of an electorate, which means that if an electorate, so say for example, especially if you're in a electorate where the votes are close between the two major parties, they are probably going to use budgetary policy to really focus on that electorate to try and win votes. And then lastly, weaknesses of budgetary policy. There can be a lot of political hurdles if the opposition or people don't come to the party and they don't want to vote on the things the government are trying to pass. They might never get across the line, even though they might be beneficial for the economy. There can be political bias. So different political parties in Australia, in the world, have certain vested interests that they have in certain things. So certain parties are going to try and achieve certain things. Like historically, Liberals been very pro-business and Labor's been very like pro-worker. Green's very obviously pro-environment. These things have a very big effect and can mean that not everyone's always going to be better off based on a certain government's budget. And to go with that, I'd really recommend, there's always really good summary articles of budgets if you look up like whatever year budget and winners and losers. It'll tell you who's better off and who's worse off because of the budget. There's an implementation lag. So because bills can take a long time to pass, they might announce something in May. It might not be enacted till say like February the next year. And that means that it is going to be some time before it actually comes into effect. Relatively inflexible as the main budget's only announced in May. So something might happen in June and then suddenly you're not really dealing with that until next May. And so a lot can change in 12 months. It's also less effective at restricting aggregate demand during a boom compared to monetary policy. So because it takes a long time to actually implement these things, we could start to get in a boom. They can't really announce things till the next May. And then after that, they've got to vote on it, get it passed. And then by the time it's coming into effect, we've been in a boom for so long, inflation's much higher, and there's all these other issues that have occurred because it takes a little while because it's inflexible. All right, that's it for strengths and weaknesses of budgetary policy. I highly recommend doing some research into recent budgets now if you haven't already, to get a few policies that you can use for almost any question. Other than that, if you have any questions, queries, quandaries at all, send me an email, send me a message, send a comment. I'm more than happy to try and help you out, do as good as you can in economics. Now we're done with budgetary policy. It means we only have monetary policy and then what is the tiny 2020 version of aggregate supply side policies to go. So we are very, very near to the end, despite the fact that I'm recording this on the 22nd of May, which is a weird thing to think about. I hope you're doing well. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.